pleasure to be here. Thanks so much to Mandra. Thanks everyone for joining the session. We're here to talk about AI and public sector productivity. If you were at the conference yesterday, you'd have heard a lot of people talking about that. It's one of the big hopes right now for the public sector that we can boost productivity, which the ONS says hasn't really been growing in the public sector for the last 20 years, depending on how you measure it. That we can improve public services, that we can improve citizen satisfaction, that we can reduce, perhaps, the amount of time our skilled public sector professionals are spending on repetitive, mundane, bureaucratic tasks, get people back to doing what they joined public service to do in the first place. So you heard a lot of talk about that yesterday. In the research we're going to present today, we're going to dig into a little bit more detail of that, try and get to some measurement of exactly how large that opportunity is, or exactly where it can be applied. Now, in addition to this being a big focus right now in the public sector, I also think that there's a real sense that this is a big moment of opportunity. This is a survey, some results from a survey that we did towards the end of last year, looking at uptake of various different types of artificial intelligence within the public sector. I won't talk through all of it right now, because it's not really the focus of this talk, but just to highlight one of the results. If you look at the bars right at the top of that screen about generative AI, we asked public sector workers in universities, schools, social care, the NHS and emergency services if they were already using generative AI in their day-to-day work, or if they knew someone else at their workplace who was using it. And the numbers were already pretty high. We can see that, for example, in schools, 30% of people saying that they're already using generative AI in their day-to-day work, and 58% of people saying they know at least one other colleague that's using it. And that's uptake in terms of less than a year of generative AI being a really sort of consumer-facing product. That's even before we started to see Copilot rolling out in Office products and now being available on lots and lots of desktops. I'm sure lots of people in the room have access to that. So we can see a sort of groundswell of uptake of these types of technologies. We can also see that people are really positive about the technologies, and that really came through in this survey as well. We asked people if they agreed with the statement, AI systems enhance my productivity. Over 70% in all of the service categories that we looked at, up to over 80% in social care, agreed with this statement. People were really confident that it was improving their productivity. We also asked people how much of their time they spent in an average week on bureaucracy, and how much of that time they thought could be saved if AI systems were applied to their fullest potential. You can see that in the bottom set of bars there. So, for example, in the NHS, people who we surveyed were saying they spent around 50% of their week on bureaucracy, and they thought that this could be reduced by 20 percentage points, so saving almost a full day per week, if AI systems were applied to their fullest potential. So what we can see right now going on, even as the technology emerges, is people within the public sector picking it up, making use of it in their day-to-day work, in their day-to-day, addressing their day-to-day challenges, and being really positive about the outcomes. And that, for me, as someone who's been doing government digital technology for the last 10 years or more, is really refreshing and really positive, because the government and public services have waves of technological modernization where people haven't felt this positive about it. But at the moment, this is happening in a sort of bottom-up fashion, and there's a lot of positive things about that. People can pick up and use the technology if they want to, but that also means it's not particularly systematic. Not everyone's using it. People are going to use it if they want to. The people who are most enthusiastic about technology are going to make use of it, but not everyone will. And so the research we're here to talk about, and I'll give over to Youmna in a second to talk through the results of that, but the research we're here to talk about is about mapping the full size and scale of the opportunity for artificial intelligence in public services. Where can it actually be applied? That's some research that we're doing right now. Here we're here to talk about part of that. We're going to focus on citizen-facing public services, things like applying for a passport, or applying for a driving license, or applying for benefits. These transactions, which are one of the most common ways in which people interact with the state, the most common ways that people interact with government, they place a huge strain on public services because there are so many of them, millions and millions of transactions per year. And what we wanted to do was to look at the potential for artificial intelligence and automation within this type of service. Now, we've released the paper today. I won't talk through the full details of the methodology because there isn't really time in this presentation. I'm happy to talk about it later in the coffee break or whenever if you want to grab me. But very briefly, we did 3 things in the research. First of all, we just tried to map the overall size and scope of citizen-facing public services offered by central government. So I'm not talking about NHS or the police or local government or other types of the wider public state, purely things that are offered by central government. As I said, things like driving licenses, passports, benefits applications, these kind of things. We tried to quantify how many of these types of services there are. We tried to quantify how many transactions go through these services, how many people are applying for passports, how many people are applying for benefits, and bring all this data together. And this was a huge effort because all of this data doesn't exist in one central place. It's in lots and lots of different spread out places. And then the third part, we tried to quantify the potential that each of these services shows for the use of automation or the use of artificial intelligence. Very briefly, we based this on a classic technique in labor economics for thinking about how amenable certain jobs are to automation by breaking down these services into different discrete tasks and measuring the extent to which these tasks are more or less routine and hence more or less amenable to automation. As I said, this is a technique that's quite widely used in labor economics to think about potential for automation. So this is what we've done. And I'm going to hand to Youmna, who's going to talk through the results.
Thanks, Jonathan. So yeah, as Jonathan mentioned, one of the key aims of the research was to quantify the size of government services. So the services under study are roughly 400 that we identified at the time of data collection. And so the first step was that we wanted to make sense of that data. We wanted to see how the services are distributed across organizations, but also importantly, we were interested in mapping these services out to service topics, which is the way that government essentially categorizes different areas of government activity. So you can see in the figure here, I'm not sure how clear it is for everyone, but the nodes of the figure represent the different organizations, and the size of the node correlates to the number of services offered by that organization, and the colors correlate to the service topic. So the first thing that stands out when you see this figure is that there are few organizations that kind of offer the lion's share of services compared to some of the other organizations. And we can also see that there's a huge breadth in the kinds of services that are being offered across government, and there's a bit as well of clarity across the broad remits of different organizations and departments. So the Department for Education, unsurprisingly, the majority of the services there fall under the category of education, training, and skills. But what's most interesting in doing this mapping is that we're also able to see the commonalities in the different functions of government. So again, I don't think it's very clear from the screen, but the bottom left quadrant of that inner circle, we can see that there's the shared service topic of business and self-employed, and that's shared across a number of different organizations that have broadly quite different remits. So for example, there's Ministry of Defense, there's the Department for Housing, Leveling Up, and Communities, and HMRC, to name a few. And this is really important because it gives us a way of thinking about the spillover effect of potential digitization and automation efforts in one specific service, how that could spill over into other services and other functions of government. So the next step in trying to make sense of the data is looking at the transaction volumes of these services. So of the roughly 400 services, we identified almost 1 billion transactions being performed per year. A large number of these transactions do appear to be automated information requests. So if you look at that figure on the bottom left, you can see that lone square at the top represents check if a vehicle is taxed, the service check if a vehicle is taxed. And this is an excellent example of an automation information request, an automated information request, because essentially to access the service, all applicants really have to do is just input vehicle registration numbers or a number plate. But of these 1 billion transactions, we do identify 143 million as what we categorize as complex transactions, or transactions which require some degree of micro decisions or information processing, to name just a few. And these kind of represent the core focus of our automation automation study. And we find that even though relative to the large number of transactions, it might seem like a small number, these represent an area of service delivery that are quite resource intensive. So we see that there's a good potential for assessing the gains that could be provided by automation. So now moving on to the potential for automation results. As Jonathan mentioned, we adopted this labor economics approach of the task-based approach. So we broke services down into the sum of the tasks that make them up. And we were able to see that most of there's a high share of routine tasks that are shared across services, but these vary quite significantly across government departments. And we find that more than 80% of the 143 million transactions have a high share of routine tasks, so high potential for automation. So that's roughly 114 million transactions per year. And the potential gains for this are huge. So we've put the statistic here that if we were to save just 1 minute on average on the time spent on these tasks, it would save the equivalent of around 1,200 years of person work per year. And then the final bit of the assessing the potential for automation was looking specifically at the potential for generative AI. So while the task-based approach is very well, provides a solid foundation and is very well established, it still doesn't really account for some of the more disruptive impacts that generative AI has on this paradigm. And so we developed a rubric in line with other work that's being done in the field that specifically considers some of the methods and tools of work which are available to civil servants and help facilitate the completion of these tasks. And we align them with the broad capabilities of generative AI to see where it could be meaningfully applied. And so we have 3 buckets, 3 ways that we've organized this potential. So we have low, medium, and high potential. And you'll find that the majority of services under study fell under that medium potential for generative AI. So just to pick out a few, applying for legal aid, applying for pension credit. And so this also just provides a novel way of kind of accounting for that disruptive impact of generative AI. And so just a quick wrap up before I hand over to Matt. The data that we collected here came from multiple sources, was quite fragmented, so there was this necessary patchworking exercise so that we could paint a fuller picture. But for this reason, a lot of the measures are estimates, but they do provide a rough overview of the potential size of service delivery. And in future rounds of the research, we're hoping to be able to test the deployment of actual AI across public services and to work with frontline service delivery workers to really identify where the opportunity areas are. So with that, I will pass to Matt.
That's good stuff. Can everyone hear me? Okay, at least that's working. Cool, fantastic. So firstly, thank you so much to ATI for having me here. So I want to talk a little bit about what CDDO is, what we care about, and then the sort of lens of both public transactions and services and the analysis that we've done about AI. So CDDO, because government does love an acronym, stands for the Central Digital and Data Office. And we basically exist at the heart of Cabinet Office to try and drive digital transformation across all of the digital and data technology profession. So that's about 30,000 people and about £10 billion worth of expenditure. We published our strategy a couple of years ago, and it focuses on a few areas. So the first is basically transforming public services. We've identified 75 of the sort of top services that we think need to be transformed. We care about things like data sharing, legacy remediation, capability building, but one of those things is around sort of emerging technology, and obviously AI is a very large part of that. So hopefully that's some context. So I have sort of 3 main reflections that I'd like to talk about. The first is the importance of the evidence base around this topic. So obviously there's a lot of hype around AI in general. Government sort of has a much lower risk tolerance around investing in some of these technologies. It's obviously spending taxpayer money. One of the real blockers to getting investment into these types of things is analysis that highlights the scale of opportunity and specifically where that opportunity is. So having sort of analysis like this that has a bottom-up granular approach that can sort of try and capture imaginations, focuses on the size of the prize, and can say where we think that sort of falls in different departments or different topics is completely invaluable. The sort of second reflection is around the use of like AI and data science techniques in analysis in general. So we were working with the Alan Turing Institute. We were sort of aware of the approach that they were taking, and we were asked a question by a very senior sort of government official, which was essentially, what's the sort of size of the prize of AI in the public sector? And by the way, you've got like 5 days to answer that. And that was pretty much impossible probably 2, 3, 4 years ago. We wanted to sort of break down how roles would map to professions, how professions would map to tasks, how tasks would then be sort of automatable. And usually what you would do is you would like hire some sort of consultancy. They'd have some really intelligent people who have wonderful degrees, and then they would sort of go through and manually map that. And that's obviously expensive and really, really slow. So we were able to sort of use a pre-tuned LLM to try and make that first decision for each of those steps. So we got a sort of bottom-up view, basically, by civil service job title, mapped that to the sort of database that was used here around profession. That came with tasks, and then we could make an assessment using a similar methodology about how sort of automatable those tasks are. And that meant that analysis that sort of wasn't really possible previously was done in a first pass in sort of 5 days or so. That analysis has come a really, really long way. I don't know if people have seen, but there was an article featuring Alex Chisholm, I think, earlier this year, where he referenced that the sort of total size of the civil service lens of this opportunity might be somewhere in the sort of magnitude of 4 to 5 billion. And 30% of tasks or so are potentially automatable. So that was a result of the analysis that we did, sort of inspired by these techniques. So my sort of second reflection is how the analytical community in general can use these types of technologies to augment their analysis on anything in a sort of meta way. In this case, it was about AI. And then the third reflection is around service transformation. So there's a couple of things here. Firstly, as I sort of mentioned, one of the things that we care tremendously about is transforming government services, as we say. If you go on to sort of our strategy, you can see the 75 services that we've decided are sort of the highest priority in government. And we collect data around sort of transactions, completion rates, click-through rates, user satisfaction, et cetera, cost per transaction. And we now have a framework that decides what a great service looks like. And we are trying to sort of collect quarterly data on this process to understand how the services are evolving and trying to get them to a sort of great potential. Through that, we've done sort of several deep dives and reviews into sort of the end-to-end service, and we've tried to sort of find the pain points in the user journey and highlighted the sort of tangible opportunities where AI could be really helpful. And the reason I bring that up is I think it sort of it marries very quite nicely with the analysis that's been found here, which is there are sort of several use cases through that journey where AI could certainly augment the sort of delivery of a public sector service. So if you think about personalization of services, you currently probably all go to gov.uk, regardless of your age or whatever sort of employment status, and you get basically the same service. You go to Netflix and Spotify, they'll change your service based on your tastes. So the ability to potentially augment sort of a personalization of a service is very, very sort of prevalent through the use of AI. There's obviously a tremendous amount of channel shift that can be taken through the uses of things like chatbots and sort of automating queries. So I think I saw yesterday that HMRC have announced that they're sort of temporarily shutting down one of their basically like call center type routes, and they're trying to funnel people through a channel shift mechanism that involves chatbots a lot more. So it's great to see that that's sort of being trialed as long as there's sort of mechanisms for people obviously who don't have access to the internet, etc. And then the third is the sort of back office processes. So it's hard to give use cases in government that sort of aren't already public, but there's lots of work being done about how we can produce like augmented assistance for people making decisions in more complex transactions. So where a person is looking through like an actual casework and they're like trying to understand multiple different pieces of information and they have to make a complex decision, using LLMs, for example, to summarize that information, to help them sort of map that, to be able to triage, all of those types of opportunities are sort of currently being explored. So I think I sort of am standing between you and questions, and I think that's probably going to be the most interesting part. So I'll probably leave it there, but there's a tremendous amount that we have sort of tried to build on the evidence base of this. There's a really, really long way to go. I think the very sort of final reflection I would make just from a sort of digital lens is the sort of graphic that you saw that showed the topics and the different departments. That's still sort of providing service provision around the architecture of government. And whilst automating and sort of using AI to make those services better and better and better is great. I think if we look at the sort of like absolute leaders in different parts of the world, sort of other governments like Estonia or Singapore, they are thinking about trying to structure those services not through the architecture of government, but through life events for the user. So having 400 services structured around 12 different departments, structured around 10 different topics, is probably not how you would design this sort of service provision for government if you were starting from scratch. You would probably think about, what does a person need to do when they turn 18? What do they do when they sort of retire? What do they do when they want to sort of have a child, etc. So, and that's the only other final reflection I would say through the lens of sort of digital and service provision, which is, whilst these technologies are tremendous in sort of improving our current services, arguably there's a different approach, which is to take it to the next level. We should genuinely think about the end-to-end user journey around the user as opposed to government. But I think I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for having me, and look forward to questions.
I'm going to come and sit down, otherwise it feels a bit weird if I'm standing over there. Well, admirably efficient, as one would expect from a productivity presentation. And there are a lot of questions coming in. There's already a lot on the Slido, so I'm going to take some off the Slido. People in the room, if you want to be old school and stick your hand up, I'll come out to you in a moment. Thank you for ending on the "I wouldn't start from here" note, which throws up the whole prospect that perhaps the entire government needs to be reorganized. Perhaps you just need to work on an AI that's sophisticated enough to redesign the whole British government system. We must be nearly there, right? Nervous laughter from the Turing Institute. All right, so there's a lot of questions. I'm going to try and group some of them because some of them are related. So there's a couple they're a bit nervous about the idea that AIs might be making decisions about people, and particularly vulnerable people. So one of them says, how can AI help applying for benefits be a fairer process? Because automating this seems like a potential opportunity to double down on rejecting people who are worthy. And someone else said they're very concerned about particularly PIP and DLA applications being automated because they say the system is already broken. And somebody else, in fact, Thomas Carroll, NHS consultant neurosurgeon, who presumably very much knows what he's talking about, says that yesterday personalised uncertainty quantification was given as a hurdle to using AI in healthcare. And so this also needs consideration for DWP and PIP about vulnerable individuals. So I don't know, I mean, perhaps we could hear like both the kind of government thing, but also the, Jonathan, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, and I think it's extremely important. And applying for benefits, especially PIP, is a really good example. I mean, that's the person with the question said the system's kind of broken right now. It's extremely difficult to make these applications. Lots and lots of the applications which are made get rejected right now. And a rejected application for PIP is an enormous amount of time spent for the person making the application, which is essentially wasted. It's also an enormous amount of time spent within the department. I think there's a lot of potential for AI to help improve the quality of applications before they're submitted. That's not actually something that we looked at in this study, but I think there's real potential there, having talked to people who specialize in this area. And I also think that there's a lot of potential for improving the analysis of those applications once they're made. And in fact, you can find examples of services within government where transactions are frequently rejected. Applications for planning permission is another really good example, which are enormously time-consuming for the person making the application and also for the person having to review the application. So I think technologies that can improve the quality of applications before they're submitted, making sure they're complete, for example, they contain all the right information, and improve the ability of people to analyze them, can do a lot of good. That doesn't mean automating the decision, which I agree. I think we're a way off doing that, and I don't really know anyone who wants to do that.
Did you want to make a response?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think sort of very similar reflections there. I think sort of AI isn't necessarily new in this context. So if we think sort of, I don't know, 5-10 years ago, I think there was use cases where Amazon were looking to use sort of machine learning for their cover letter process, and they found that they were just doubling down on the bias that they already had in their organization. So I think this isn't necessarily a new problem. Is the sort of first reflection. The second is the inherent risk that's built into the system of government means that they generally take this very seriously. There used to be a sort of an entity, I think, called the Center of Data Ethics. I think it might have rebranded very sort of recently, but there's always a consistent sort of lens taken to all of these applications where we view that system. My personal reflection would be is these technologies should be applied in the most boring, easy use cases to start with. So you mentioned healthcare. Like the amount of times that a nurse is like taking notes and then they're having to write that up and then they're having to put that into a system, like, you know, there's no real danger to have summarization, sort of augmentation to those types of things. And we can get, you know, as the technology matures and we get much better understanding of it, we can get to the point where it's trying to sort of make more complex decisions. But for now, I'd focus on the boring things.
Well, I don't know. I mean, there's been some horror stories of people relying on LLMs for quite critical information, like briefs in legal cases where the fabulation meant that this was a problem. I'm not sure nurses taking notes is something that you'd want ChatGPT-4 to be making things up on. But so there's a couple of questions that lead on quite nicely from that. One of them says from Mark Wright, says, humans making some decisions is still desirable. Is the government considering building its own LLM to reduce bias and misinformation? And somebody else suggests, if the government do make their own LLM, will it be safe to use personal data on? And then somebody else, Keith, says, has anyone in government considered trying to develop an LLM that reports how biased other LLMs are? But the idea that perhaps the thing to do is to build your own LLM to avoid external bias. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Again, I think a couple of reflections there, like the sort of the magnitude of cost and the sort of associated data means that there's a huge competitive advantage to the people who are sort of already trying to, publish it in, 3 or 4 very large entities. Means that you're unlikely, I imagine, to get to a point where an entity other than those already is making sort of large advancements in this. Similarly, I don't necessarily think the LLM itself is likely to have inherent biases. It's going to be in the sort of data and the processes and the decision making that's come before. So making our own LLM doesn't necessarily strike me as the solution to that. It's probably things around, as I say, the ethics, the data quality, the actual sort of human in the loop type process.
Okay.
Yeah, just to add that I think with regards to the example that you gave about people relying on LLMs for very critical information, I think we also need to remember it's very context specific, and each department within their respective remits will have to analyze if it's the right use case for them. And also, so for the rubric that we developed, we do take into account that as much as we can the different contexts, and that's why you'll find that quite a few services actually ranked as having low potential for generative AI, because we take into account kind of the interactive element and the discretionary decision-making element as well. So I think it's very context-specific.
Fantastic. Now, this is quite slightly from the other point of view. Somebody suggested that the narrative of productivity, is there a danger that the narrative of productivity equating to job cuts would hamper willingness to adopt it in the public sector? So that people who work in the sectors might think, well, okay, great, but if you make me 50% more efficient, it just means you're going to sack 50% of us. Is that a justified fear? Is there any way you can guard against that?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's a political choice about what people are trying to sort of achieve. I think, there's already government announcements that have stated previously, maybe it was previous prime ministers, they wanted to sort of cut, 90,000 or 450,000 roles. They're going to try and do that whether they are using AI or not. So I think whatever the political choice is, I have no opinion on or control over, but if someone decides they want to do that, this might be the best way to augment that. I think you've sort of seen from the analysis that was done there that it's already being quite heavily adopted. So I don't imagine it'll be a tremendous barrier, but I do understand that it'll be a fear for people.
I mean, just coming back to the survey that we did before Christmas, we also asked people if they were worried about replacement. And very few of the professionals that we talked to were really worried about that prospect. They were excited, not about their job being cut, but about the amount of time that it takes to do their job fitting within a normal working week, which at the moment, let's get to that before we even start to talk about cutting roles. So I think it's a legitimate thing to have in mind, 100%. But I think we do also need to recognise enthusiasm for the people who are having to do the very routine tasks at the moment, that their own enthusiasm for things that will help them with their jobs.
I do want to come out to the room, in case there's people in the room with a burning question. There are lots of questions coming on Slido, but does anyone in the room want to ask a question live? Yes, hand right here on the second row, thank you. Oh, and there's one right at the back as well. If we can get a microphone to right to the back while this person is speaking.
Hi, yeah, Phil Walmsley, DHSC. So, yeah, obviously I'm sort of in the circle on this, so I appreciate all the things you've said so far, but I wonder if we could be a little bit more critical about kind of the second order effects. So some of these are sort of somewhat trivial. So I heard an example recently of a friend who needed to give a business justification for a subscription to a journal in his organisation, used ChatGPT and was very proud to send off 2 pages of text where, having previously applied the same thing, 2 lines would have done, but someone had to go and read that. That's like a trivial example. But a more significant one, I guess, is just focusing on the size of the prize in terms of 4 to 5 billion. Okay, that's obviously a lot of money, but if you look at the whole public sector budget or the whole economy or something like that, and then you say, okay, what does it mean to actually make better strategic decisions? A relatively small increase of that can be a bigger deal, but similarly, are we worried about reducing the quality of decisions because we're demanding less attention from people? Because by streamlining a lot of these processes, you're actually then putting a lot more information past senior decision makers faster because you can, and those bottlenecks in the system are still there. So I guess it's just thinking through like what it means to make good decisions and that kind of outcome focus, rather than focusing too much on have people just adopted AI for AI's sake. So just trying to make sure we're focusing on those outcomes. And I wonder if people have comments maybe on how we think about those second order effects and the fact that, as I say, it's the sort of return on investment for the country as a whole, which we need to focus on, and how we get the best there.
There's actually, I'm going to supplement that with a couple of questions that came in that are broadly related, I think, about the kind of the wider impact on working practices. One person suggested that in yesterday's discussion, the concern of how LLMs automating processes for entry-level workers can destroy the path to developing expertise. And does that apply here? And then a related question, how will automation be managed to avoid losing experience? Because micro decisions often require substantial experience to be made well and equitably. So this idea that you by taking away the necessity for junior level people to plough through reading old documents or doing more or less routine tasks, you actually take away a vital part of the training and experience building process so that people may be catapulted into reading these long automated things with no real sense of how you go about making the decisions. So yeah, it'd be interested to hear from any of you on that.
I mean, I'll start just briefly. I mean, there's clearly, in addition to the technology, a lot of importance around management processes in terms of adopting this and making the best of it. I'm old enough to remember the arrival of email and some of the hopes and expectations that we'd spend far less time on correspondence than we did in the past, because we had this wonderful, and now I don't think, email remains a big part of our lives, right? So there is a big danger, I think, that we can do stuff quicker, therefore we do more reporting, we do more statutory stuff, or stuff that was 2 lines is now 2 pages, long. I do have to say that, I mean, I take the point that people may not go through the same initiation processes in organisations that we went through. And we might feel as senior people a little bit bitter about that people don't have to trawl through. You don't spend a year writing statutory reports, therefore you haven't paid your dues. But there must be better ways of training and initiating those people rather than just jamming them through the same process. And these are processes, again, and I've said this a few times, but I'll come back to it. These are processes that make a lot of people in the public sector miserable and make a lot of public sector jobs not very much fun. And a lot of people leave. And we have lots of skilled people across social work, education, police, health, who leave every year. And part of that is because of workload, and part of the workload is driven by bureaucracy. So I think from my point of view, always have to keep that part in mind as well.
Yeah, similarly, I think there's a pro and a con to it. I think the thing I'd like to still say is, like, the technology has potential and it does have positives. The experience that I've had in, like, it helping me with very sort of boring admin-y tasks when you're constrained is fantastic. If you think about things like end-of-year reviews and, like, submitting nominations for vouchers and things like this, it's like, text-based stuff that is a lot of effort. ChatGPT has almost removed that type of process for me. At the same time, I do genuinely think your point is a bit of a risk, which is the human still has the potential to ruin this sort of adoption of technology. So if you think about, like, Copilot, it's writing code really, really well now. It's only ever going to get better. Where are we going to get the junior developers from, and how are they learning to code? Because if they're just using Copilots, then then how are they ever learning the actual sort of, the syntax of the language and the structure and the logic? Similarly, I think how LLMs have sort of bounced into education over the last sort of 18 months. People are just writing essays doing that. Are they learning the content in the same way that they would have 5 years ago? So I genuinely do think that's a risk, but I think it's only going to be the human that's going to ruin that sort of technology as opposed to the technology itself.
I feel I should say at this point, do not use LLMs to write your essays. It's very frowned upon in academia and you may be failed. Carry on.
If I can just add, I think it's a really great point, and I think again it goes back to this point of it has to be very context and domain specific. So for example, in the context of healthcare as a domain, we know that there's a lot of value in that function of oversight. So for a junior doctor to be able to explain to their senior doctor the decision-making process and why they made a decision about a specific pathway for care, for example. So I think this is where the task-based approach that we're kind of proposing also really comes in quite as a very useful tool, because we're able to assess the tasks which could potentially benefit from some form of automation that don't have a high level of discretion associated with them, and that might look different across different domains. And there was a recent, just kind of adding into the question that was on fears and concerns about automation, and it kind of, I think, ties in well here. There was, the ONS recently released a time use survey looking at public sector productivity, and one of the things they found was that there's actually respondents responded quite favorably to the implementation of artificial intelligence and automation for those kind of mundane routine tasks, provided that there was sufficient oversight and implementation. So yeah, I think that's something.
Actually, a little supplementary question that's come in online. Presumably those polled from the NHS were not employed specifically to carry out admin tasks, is this correct? In other words, were they clinical staff? So did you poll both admin and clinical staff in the NHS?
There's a mix. There's a mix of all sorts of people, yeah.
Marvellous. So somebody at the back, I think, has the microphone.
Yeah, with all the processes we've been talking about at the moment is more focused on the people and staff sitting behind, but what about the users sitting in front? How can you, like, for example, speed up the application process using automation? Is there any plans for this to happen, especially with like .gov and visa applications specifically, with the long-winded processes we got so far?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's like a genuine army of people in government trying to solve all of those problems. As I say, there's sort of 30,000 people, billions of pounds worth of expenditure, hundreds of services. AI is a very small part of that. Like, robotic process automation has existed for quite some time. Even just service design being better and things like sending a notification to you to say, by the way, the status of your application is this, and therefore you don't have to ring a call center. Like, even initiatives like that are very, very useful. So there is a huge amount of effort from very, very basic, simple things to thinking about how we can put LLMs into actual public-facing services. As I say, I think the risk appetite of government and the sort of inherent challenges it has in that means that the adoption of things like LLMs in public-facing services are going to be a little bit slower. As soon as something goes publicly facing, there will be people who are trying to sort of break it and make it say silly things, as always the way. So they really have to make sure there's a very robust process in place to make sure that these things are avoided. But it's certainly something that people are putting some genuine effort into.
Okay, there are a couple of related questions from the Slido, and then if I have time, I will come back out. I know there was another hand here. So, personalisation to be effective requires personal information, potentially shared with US big tech. How do we address the fear associated with this prospect? Somebody else says, how does the government plan to identify people accessing these services digitally? While Estonia is rightly flagged, they have digital identity utilities, and that's obviously something that's still quite contentious in this country. And finally, how is it safe to be assuming that AI can speed up activities which are all about personal data? So basically, related questions there. Are we headed for a digital identity service by default? And how do we guard against people's privacy being intruded upon by having to share personal data, which will then go up potentially to big organisations outside of government? I don't know if you two have any thoughts on potential ways to address that.
Do you want to go?
I think this is where regulation really comes in. And I mean, I think maybe Matt might be able to speak a bit better about some of the processes that are in place, but transparency and regulations. Yeah, I'm not really sure what more I could say there, but I would say regulation plays a really key role in ensuring that data is not misused and personal data is not misused. And then there's a whole host of questions that comes alongside accountability and how you can ensure that, but that's a completely different stream of conversation.
Okay.
Yeah, again, a few reflections here. So I think the first is I worked in Gov.uk as an analyst at some point, and without things like an identity system, we had very little information about any of our users. I think cookie consent means that only 30% of people were saying yes. I didn't have the IP address, the location. I knew nothing of these users, and there's very little that we could do. So the good news is like the sort of general sort of experience that you have on Gov.uk is one that is very anonymized. There is a one login program that already exists, which is funded, it's published, you may be using it, and it is a digital identity solution that is trying to give access in sort of one way to multiple services, and that will try and do different sort of features in terms of asking you if you would like to consent into sharing information. I think there's also an expectation from the user that far more is happening than actually is. Like, even in healthcare, I think one practice being able to share it with another in a geographical way requires genuine permissions and consent in a way where I think the user would just assume that the NHS has all of this data flowing around already. So it's probably less of a risk than people perceive it to be currently in terms of how conservative government really is. And the other sort of final thing, I think that again, personal reflection is I've always find this juxtaposition a little odd, which is that Google is live tracking my location pretty much constantly. Apple's monitoring my heart rate constantly, and yet we're upset that the government knows where I live and how much I earn, which is it definitely already knows. So I do think there's something about changing the perception of public trust, which is we are genuinely 99% of people there are not hostile actors in any way, right? We're genuinely trying our absolute best to make services as good as possible. And I think the narrative around public trust needs to change a little bit there when it comes to being able to provide some of these things.
Although, as a Google employee once said to me, Google can't send uniformed state employees around to my house, and the government can. Although you're right, absolutely. I'm sure all of us in this room, the government knows who we are, where we live, how much tax we pay, all that kind of thing. So I think there's someone in the middle. Oh, there's a couple of people. Okay, so I'm going to take a couple more from the room. They're both in the middle, so you might need to converge. And if you give two microphones, and we'll do whoever gets it. There you are. So we'll start with you, and then when you're done, we'll go to you. I'm going to take, because we're running out of time, so I'm going to take a couple of points to the floor and then come back and let you sum up.
Hi there. Thank you very much to all of you today. Mine's around, we've spoken a lot about the mundane tasks. When we effectively start training these models on those mundane tasks, how quickly do we progress up to the less mundane tasks?
Excellent and pithy. I like that in an audience member. Who's got the microphone here?
Thank you. So I'm a data science consultant working in the public sector, and I spend a lot of my time kind of walking the people I talk to back from the generative AI cliff edge. I feel like we often forget now that generative AI has taken the media by storm, that there are other forms of machine learning and data science. Did you look into how that can be applied in a public service, where that could be impactful, and how maybe just reviewing your documents rather than passing them to an LLM that sits in some server farm in America might be better?
Okay, thank you very much. We have 2 minutes left, so if you'd like to give us your final thoughts, possibly addressing these questions or anything else that you wanted to sum up with. Let's start with you, Jonathan.
Sure, just very briefly. So yeah, the study was about, in general, how automatable tasks are. It doesn't have a strong opinion on what could be used to do that. In fact, there's a lot that can be done with just robotic process automation, which isn't really AI at all, depending on how you define it. So we just use this method from labor economics, looking at whether tasks are routine or not within service provision. I completely agree that, often when you see people trying to use generative AI to make decisions, you think, well, there's a whole other field of AI that's much more tuned towards thinking about decisions, if you even want to go down that decision-making road. And then, 100% agree. I think the mundane, boring tasks are where the opportunity are. And there's often two faces of AI. Either it's this amazing technology that can do things that no human could ever do, or this thing that can do stuff that everyone can do easily, but no one wants to do. And I think that's where you have to focus. That's where the big gains are from my point of view.
Yeah, very similar answers. I think to your point about Gen AI, it's almost being used as a bit of a Trojan horse, which is we've never had this much interest around anything that we're doing in this space. As I say, technologies have existed for sort of 10, 15 years that we still aren't using that could be really, really useful. So when we say AI and Gen AI, like we're using the whole opportunity to be like digital transformation, service design, better user research, content provision, robotic process automation. So all of those things are sort of being funneled behind this emphasis on AI.
I think I would just want to emphasize the importance of something like, for example, stakeholder engagement. So with this line of research, we're essentially just trying to develop a method that would help shed light on the types of, first of all, what government, the size of government, the volume of transactions, but also what types of tasks could be more or less amenable to automation. But we're also not saying that we should completely, from top down, implement these technologies and not at all engage with the public, not at all engage with the civil servants that are delivering these services. So again, going back to the point of that it's very context specific, very domain specific, and it will really be down to each individual department or each individual organization to decide how best to adopt this technology and not to underestimate, not to take that power away essentially from them. Yeah.
Fantastic. What a great note to end on. Apologies if we didn't get to your question on Slido. There were so many really good questions. So we fitted in as many as we could. Perhaps you'll be able to. Somebody did ask whether the paper was available that you were talking about. So I assume that's available through Turing.
Yes, yeah, it's on the website.
Yes. So if you do some kind of a web search, possibly using an LLM or not, no, probably not, then you will be able to find it. So please thank this excellent panel for, I think, really, really interesting